Good afternoon. My name is Bill Capicenti. I'm a clinical associate professor in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. And the school, along with the Foley Institute, is co-sponsoring this event today. And I should say right at the outset that the director of the Foley Institute, Colonel Clayton, wanted to send his regrets that he couldn't be here today, but he wanted to be. If you've been reading the newspapers, you may know that Thomas Foley passed away recently. And so Dr. Clayton is in Washington for the memorial service. So that's why he's not here. Otherwise, he would be here. And I should say, too, at the outset, that this presentation that we have today is part of an ongoing series, Science, Ethics, and Policy series. It's a collaboration between the Foley Institute and the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. So, let's see. And one other announcement before we get too far in. If you're a student and you're looking for extra credit, there'll be a sign-up in the hall, a table out in the hall, so you can sign up right after the event. Here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to give an introduction to each of our four speakers at the beginning, and then we'll let them come up in order, moving from my left to right, your right to left. And then we're going to spend the second half of the time taking questions from the audience, and they can be directed to any of the members of our panel. So I'll go ahead and introduce them now. Again, I'm going to sit down and let them come up one at a time to do their introductions. So first of all, sitting here on your immediate right, Paul Thompson is the W.K. Kellogg Chair and Professor of Agriculture, Food, and Community Ethics at Michigan State University. With interests in environmental and agricultural ethics, Paul has served on a number of national and international committees on agricultural biotechnology and has published extensively on the environmental and social significance of agriculture. So we're very grateful to have Paul here as an out-of-town guest to be part of this panel. And then sitting to Paul's right, Dr. Michael Neff as an associate professor and director of Washington State University's Molecular Plant Biosciences graduate program, as well as the assistant chair of the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences. His research uses biochemical, molecular, and genetic approaches to examine plant development, as well as goals to increase yield in environmental crops and agricultural crops by studying photomorphogenic and hormone signaling pathways. And then sitting to Dr. Neff's right, also from WSU, Dr. Chuck Benbrook is a research professor and program leader at the Center for Sustaining Agriculture and Natural Resources. Chuck's research has focused on food quality and safety, as well as the impacts of agricultural technology and policy. Chuck has held several positions in Washington, D.C., including executive director of the U.S. House of Representatives Agricultural Subcommittee in 1981. And then finally, sitting to an extreme right, Heather Hansen is the executive director of Washington Friends of Farms and Forests, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating the public on the technology behind production of safe, economical food. She also serves on the Washington State University's College of Agriculture, Human and Natural Resource Sciences Kitchen Cabinet, and is on the advisory board of the William D. Ruckelshaus Center for Public Policy. And again, I'm very grateful for each of our panelists being here today and taking time to present. Our first two panelists, Dr. Thompson and Dr. Neff, are going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Dr. Benbrook and Ms. Hansen are going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then, as I said, we're going to devote the rest of the time to interaction. So that'll be time when you can pose questions to any of the panelists. So we look forward to that as well. So again, thank you for being here. Please welcome Dr. Thompson.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to start out by giving myself a little bit of introduction. In 1997, I wrote a book called Food, Biotechnology, and Ethical Perspective, and it was an attempt to be an ethically balanced assessment of some of the issues associated with biotech broadly, but especially genetic engineering. And I would say that in a nutshell, my position was that the technology has a lot of promise, but that there would be reasons, political reasons, cultural reasons, perhaps even religious reasons, why people wouldn't want to use this technology, so that one of the ethical conditions for making this for realizing a lot of the environmental and nutritional promise of biotechnology would be to create a set of social institutions that allow people to continue to make choices based on those personal and cultural values. I also need to show this slide because there's a little bit of understandable confusion about who Paul Thompson is, given the fact that there are two philosophers named Paul Thompson who are out there occupying the space of talking about genetic engineering in agriculture. I'm not the good-looking one, okay? I have, as I've already indicated, written a number of pieces on biotech. I've also written quite a bit on sustainability in agriculture. My namesake has also written a book on biotechnology, which came out in 2011. That, I believe, is the only thing he's written on biotechnology. But he has actually toured internationally speaking on biotechnology, and he has had a relationship with Monsanto. And I make no judgments about his work. I actually think his philosophical work is quite good, but perhaps you can see why I don't want to be confused with him. I'm going to skip the definitions, and actually I'll leave that to the next speaker. This slide is really just intended to show that there's a tremendous amount of complexity in talking about the trade, the environmental, the social dimensions of biotech. And if you really want to get into some of that stuff, you're going to have to read my book, I'm afraid, because the only thing that I'm really going to talk about right here is one very specific issue that I hopefully can say something meaningfully about in only 10 or 15 minutes. And that would be this question of should the products of food biotechnology be labeled? As someone working in the domain of ethics, I'm primarily interested in this should question. And what I'm interested in is a set of reasonably coherent reasons for answering that question either in the affirmative or in the negative. If we look at the situation as it currently exists, and I'm sure many of you know this, there are currently no U.S. federal policies that require foods from biotechnology to be labeled. The USDA organic program prohibits the use of genetic engineering and cloning. And so therefore, people who want to avoid products of biotechnology can do so by buying organic food. So in some respects, this concern about can you make your choices based on cultural values, the only opt-out that's currently available is to purchase organic food. But as you well know in the state of Washington, ballot initiatives for mandatory labeling have been fought at enormous expense on a state-by-state basis for over 10 years. What I really want to try to do is to actually go back and look at how we got into this situation with the federal structure of labeling. And I think by doing that, I'll give you a picture of two really different philosophies for thinking about labeling. And in the 1990s, the Food and Drug Administration was in the process of putting into place a whole set of policies about claims that could be made about food. And they decided that there are a number of things that you can say. As long as you are meeting the various requirements, you can say that it's organic, you can say that there's no sodium, so on and so forth. But there are some things that you can't say, at least about peanut butter. And one of them would be that it doesn't contain cholesterol. In fact, peanut butter doesn't contain cholesterol, but the reason for that is that no peanut butter contains cholesterol. And FDA interpreted putting a label, and prior to about 1995, you could buy bags of peanuts and jars of peanut butter that said no cholesterol. FDA interpreted that claim to imply a health benefit, which in fact was non-existent because no peanut butter contains cholesterol. You also can't make a claim like light, no matter how you spell it. And prior to about 1995, this peanut butter might have been labeled light because there was another brand of peanut butter that was darker, right? It was a little more brown looking, right? So this would have been considered light peanut butter. You actually could go down to the grocery store in the early 90s and buy a light banana cream pie that was a little less yellow than the regular banana cream pie. So that was basically the framework that FDA was dealing with. They were also in the process of trying to develop what's now a very familiar label. And in the process of figuring out these claims, they did an enormous amount of consumer research to really get an understanding of how product claims and product labels are used by consumers, and their focus was how can this label be constructed in a way that helps consumers make healthier choices. And they wound up with a general philosophy for thinking about claims about food and about labeling. I'll say right now that the FDA in 2013 is really different than the FDA in 1997, and there are a lot of claims made about food in 2013 that would not have been allowed by the FDA in 1997. But the general philosophy that they adopted at that time was that labels should be evaluated in terms of whether they promote scientifically certifiably more healthful choices by consumers. If a label helps a consumer make a more healthful choice and there's scientific evidence that supports that, it's a good label from FDA's perspective. If it doesn't do that, it's a bad label from FDA's perspective. Now, elsewhere in the federal government, there was a very different philosophy that was starting to emerge. And this was basically a philosophy that was focused on just ordinary market relations. Labels should help the seller of a food product find a willing buyer. It should help people who want the same thing, or a seller who has something to sell and somebody wants to buy it, find each other. And this was what was emerging in the agricultural marketing service at USDA, and it was emerging in the context of developing the USDA organic label, which of course is now also very familiar to people. If you've been on the USDA webpage, you know that this very clearly states that there are no implied health benefits associated with organic. Of course, many people believe that organic food is healthier, but the label was set up on a marketing basis and not intended, as a matter of fact, specifically stating that it does not imply a health benefit. So what happens is you have these two different philosophies that are operating in different agencies in the federal government. And to be totally honest about it, the reason this was happening was because Congress had passed two totally separate pieces of legislation that required both of these agencies to develop these kinds of labels, these kinds of policies about labeling. FDA was supposed to be getting rid of all of this confusion about supposedly light or healthy food, and on the other hand, USDA was supposed to be helping this emerging sector of organic producers find willing buyers for their products. And Congress had mandated both of these things to happen. And it's about at this time, it was actually in 1996 when the first GMO crops were planted, and by 1997 they were actually being fairly widely planted, that GMOs emerge on the scene. And how are they going to be treated according to these two philosophies? Well, if we come over here and look at this policy that was in force at the FDA, we basically would notice that avoiding GMOs wouldn't promote more healthy choices. Consensus then, and I think still now, is that there's no health-based reason to avoid eating GMOs. Many people might not agree with that, just as many people might not agree with the official policy on organic, but there's really not a lot of scientific evidence that would support this claim. So, from FDA's perspective, there's no basis for requiring a label. In addition to that, they were concerned that if you had labels on there, that people would take this to imply that there was some sort of health benefit. And so actually, FDA developed a policy of discouraging GMO-free labels. I don't have time to go into the details of this, but the product that this really played out on was recombinant levensmetotropin, which some of you may know about. Actually, it was made from a recombinant organism used in dairy production. I come from a dairy state. It's not very widely used in Michigan anymore, but a decade of fights about whether you could say your product was free from recombinant VST. In '97, FDA was very much on the side of discouraging those kinds of labels. Those labels are all over the place in the Midwest. I can't speak to what you have out here in the Northwest. So again, a very different environment today than when this was emerging. We come over here and look at the organic label. The first proposal that came out of USDA basically said, well, why shouldn't organic include GMO, right? This was basically just a decision that was being made by the Organic Standards Board at USDA. And again, their basis for making this decision is to match up willing sellers and buyers. And so they made a proposal, said, why not have genetically engineered organic food? But a flood of people complained about this, and it became very clear to the Organic Standards Board that allowing GMOs under the organic label would not help willing sellers match up with willing buyers. And so that's how we basically got into this situation that we currently have. Now I want to explain why I opposed this situation, especially in 1997. Actually, the organic label didn't really come into place until 1999. So there was a period of 2 or 3 years when there was really no way for somebody who didn't want to eat genetically engineered food to have any kind of ability in the marketplace to discriminate. The organic option wasn't available. And so basically what my argument was that actually our food system is full of all kinds of claims which relate to various cultural values, but they don't have anything to do with health. And I would start out by pointing out explicitly religious-oriented claims. Our legal system has been developed to accommodate people who want to claim that food has been produced according to a kosher standard. And many people who eat kosher food think that it's healthier, but there's no health claim that's implied by saying that food is kosher. We actually require country of origin labels, but there's certainly no scientific evidence which suggests that food that's grown in the United States is healthier than food that's grown in Argentina. Basically, what matters is how it's grown, whether or not it has any contaminants. Country of origin has no scientific bearing on health, but this is actually a required label by the federal government. We also have labeling that identifies animal species. We actually, this now falls under general product ingredient labels, but we had legal requirements on animal species for many years, but there's no scientific evidence that eating unpreferred kinds of animals is a health risk. So, for all the government should be concerned, if they were consistently applying their policy, they wouldn't be preventing dog meat from being used in hot dogs. We'd have real dog hot dogs, right? Obviously, this is something that's culturally inappropriate in our context. We are not a nation of people that eat dog meat, and there's a tremendous amount of political, cultural support for this policy. It's not controversial that we keep dog meat out of our hot dogs, but again, there's no scientific reason for doing so. So my general view was that there are a lot of cultural reasons why we structure our labeling and our product claims system in the way that we do. And I predicted in 1997, of course, before the products were on the market, that there would be significant numbers. I didn't think it would be majorities, but significant numbers of people who would, in fact, not want to eat genetically engineered food. And my general take on this is that people shouldn't be put in a position where they have to produce a scientific risk assessment just to justify their personal, religious, cultural, or political food preferences. You should be able to vote with your food dollars for people that you like or whatever. Now we move fast forward to the current era, and a more focused question is, does any of this actually justify mandatory labels? And I'm going to close with just some quick thoughts on this. I think there are some reasons why we might not want to go with a mandatory label. A kosher label is not a mandatory label. Product of origin is a mandatory label. But it might be that a food industry that would voluntarily label something as non-GO might be a more supportable way to accommodate the kinds of concerns that I have. So why wouldn't we want to have mandatory labels? Well, I think the most important reason is that the segregation of the food system and the certification process that's associated with that, and then actually applying the label, being sure that the label is true, all of this costs something. And the question is, who pays? If the label's mandatory, then that cost is spread very broadly through the food system. It's true that mandatory health labels may imply a health or risk message that's not supported by the scientific evidence. I find this personally less convincing because I think there's a lot of labels out there that people take to have health implications that clearly have no health implications. I think significantly now people who don't want to eat GM food can actually eat organic food. So I think the more fundamental right is, in a technical sense at least, protected under the current system. What about reasons in favor of mandatory labeling? Well, here I would actually basically say that we've really, by now it's very clear that I was right in 1997, and there are a lot of people who don't want to eat genetically engineered food, and they have all sorts of personal reasons for not wanting to do that. Some of them are related to their beliefs about health, but many of them are related to their politics and to a whole range of other kinds of concerns. The food industry has just shown itself to be very resistant and unwilling to voluntarily develop the alternative. So maybe consumers actually deserve a way to express these cultural, religious, political, and personal values that cluster around GMOs. These ballot initiatives are a way of basically telling the food industry it's time to shape up and let us express these values a little more straightforwardly. So I will stop with that. Thank you.
As you can see, I didn't bring any slides, right? I'm being cut off. No, so I was asked to come here today to basically speak about the definition of GMOs and then, of course, to answer any questions that the members of the audience may have. So you probably, as you hear these debates, you'll hear people say we've been genetically engineering crops since the beginning of time. And yes, we have been breeding crops to feed us better and more efficiently for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. But when we're talking about the GM debate, we're talking specifically about plants that have had a piece of DNA that's either from that plant or another plant or any organism that's been inserted into that plant's genome, if we're talking about GM crops. And so basically it is crops that have been developed to express new traits through the process of what we call genetic engineering. So what is genetic engineering? Genetic engineering is the simplest way to think of it is we're cutting and pasting DNA. So in order to express a gene in a plant, we need 3 pieces of information. We need the gene, which encodes a trait. And 2 of the most common traits in GM crops are insect resistance by expressing a gene from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, or Roundup Ready, which are plants that express a mutant form of a particular enzyme that makes that plant resistant to the application of an herbicide called Roundup. In addition to that trait, we need a promoter, which is a piece of DNA that is upstream of the trait encoding DNA, and that promoter tells the plant genome when and where to express that gene and at what level. And then we need a terminator, which is different than Arnold Schwarzenegger, or different than the Terminator technology that you may have heard about in the news. That's just another piece of DNA that says this is where the gene stops, okay? And then the way we get those pieces of DNA into the plant genome, there's basically 2 main ways. One way is to use a bacteria called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Agrobacterium in the wild causes crown gall. In orchards and vineyards, you'll see old orchards and vineyards, you'll see plants with crown gall. That's where the bacteria has infected the plant. What the bacteria does is it inserts a portion of its genome into the plant genome, and the genes that the bacteria inserts then force the plant to feed the bacteria. Okay? And what genetic engineers have done is genetically engineer that bacteria by removing those genes and basically developing a system where we can insert any of the genes that we want to into a circle of DNA, which we call a plasmid, put that into Agrobacterium, and then the Agrobacterium will insert those genes of interest into the plant genome. The other way is the gene gun, which actually originally was a .22 caliber shell, basically. And the way that principle works is by coating gold dust, oropheno, very, very small particles of gold with DNA, and then shooting those pieces of gold into the plant cell. The gold particles are so small that often they don't destroy the cell as they go in. They go in through the cell wall, through the membrane, and then for some unknown, we don't understand exactly what the mechanism is, but then the DNA that is on those particles of gold get incorporated into the plant genome. Now, as I said, that DNA can be from any source. It can be from another plant, it could be from an animal, it could be from a bacteria, and the two main traits are Roundup Ready, or herbicide resistance, and then insect resistance, BT. There's one other, I think, an important topic within the GE discussion, which is disease resistance. So, and it's insect resistance and disease resistance is where perhaps genetic engineering could actually help organic production, because you could develop varieties that are resistant to an insect or a disease where you no longer have to spray with an insecticide or a fungicide, for example, in order for that crop to grow. One of the classic stories with regard to that was with regard to the papaya ring spot mosaic virus, which is a virus that is transmitted by insects into papaya plants. And it causes, if the papaya plant is infected badly enough, it will kill the plant. And even mild infections will create a fruit that is unappealing and is not as easy to market. Normally, what breeders do when developing a new strain that is resistant to a certain pathogen is they can do a cross with another wild relative or a closely related plant that has resistance to that particular trait, and then do what we call introgression, or move that bit of DNA from one plant into the crop genome so that that crop expresses a resistance trait. And that's done all the time with wheat, with corn, with barley, lettuce, all sorts of crops, tomatoes. That sort of approach is used. The problem with papaya is there is no relative on this earth that has resistance to that virus in a way where we could bring that resistance in through conventional breeding. And so in that particular case, what scientists at Cornell did was they expressed a portion of the virus genome, and by doing that, they basically gave the plant a vaccine that made it virus resistant. And so in that particular case, we probably will get to a point where we won't be able to grow papaya anywhere in the world unless there's GE papaya, because we don't have any other way of controlling that particular virus. I'm going to stop here, but I want to say one more thing. When we're talking about organic and the possibility of organic and GE working together, it's something that I like to discuss with my students. I think it's something that we should, personally, I think that we should leave that discussion on the table. It's something we should be talking about. In Hawaii, they do grow organic papaya. But how can that be if there is no resistance to the virus and you can't use GE in order to have an organic crop? Well, the way they do it in Hawaii is they will have an organic plot with your organic papaya that is completely surrounded by GMO papaya. And so by surrounding that plot with plants that are resistant to the virus, then those plants will not harbor the virus, and the insects will not be able to bring the virus into the organic plots in the center. So we're already getting into a situation where even organic production is at some level, or can be at some level, dependent on genetic engineering. So we'll stop it there. You've got the science behind how these plants are made and some of the major traits, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions when we get to that portion.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to the Foley Institute for this invitation. I had the pleasure, actually, of getting to work for 3 years with Speaker Foley during the part of my career, the early part of my career, when I ran a congressional subcommittee of the House Ag Committee. In the years right before I took that staff director job, Congressman Foley was the chairman of the House Ag Committee. he went on to become the majority whip before he became speaker, and Kiko de la Garza, a congressman from Texas, took over the chairmanship. And I remember very much how much respect Congressman Foley had among all the members of the Agriculture Committee. He had a huge influence on how any piece of agricultural legislation played out because of his command of the issues and his understanding of what different parts of the country, different parts of our agricultural system needed to get along. And I've often remarked to friends, what a shame it is there aren't more members of Congress like him these days. So I was asked by the Foley Institute to talk about some of the arguments that have been advanced in support of I-522, the ballot initiative that's triggered more political advertising in the state of Washington, I understand, than any previous ballot initiative. It's an initiative that clearly has focused a lot of attention on issues about genetically engineered food. Many people don't know a lot about, and I think it will be the beginning of a longer term discussion about the role of this technology in agriculture production. The arguments in support of I-522, and let me just say I'm not a spokesperson for the campaign, I'm not taking a position, but I am aware of both what the arguments for and against it are, and I'll do my best to accurately reflect both of those. One of the major arguments is that consumers have a basic right to know, and labeling GMO foods is a part of having an efficient marketplace that's responsive to consumer demands. It's also very true that in high-value agricultural markets, of which Washington State is a major supplier to high-value markets here in the U.S., throughout the Pacific Northwest, in the Pacific Rim, transparency is an absolutely essential ingredient for both gaining access to those markets and holding it over time. And labeling genetic engineering, the presence of genetic engineering, engineered ingredients in food is kind of a minimal need for any food company that really aspires to respond to the consumer's right to know and believes in transparency. A second reason and set of arguments in support of the initiative is that labeling of genetically engineered foods is really needed to advance the science of risk assessment for genetically engineered foods. We've got just this year the first genetically engineered vegetable that's widely consumed by Americans, sweet corn. There's a new performance series variety of sweet corn that has 3 different Bt genes in it, as well as the Roundup Ready gene. It's not approved for sale in Washington, Oregon, or Idaho, and I'm really curious why, but it is approved for sale in several other states and also in Canada, and in fact has been fairly widely marketed in Canada in this year. So in 2013 will be the first year that people in North America will be ingesting a fruit or vegetable or any other food that has intact Bt proteins in them. The other 2 Bt crops that Mark mentioned, Bt corn and Bt cotton, those crops are either fed to animals or processed into oil, or in the case of corn, high fructose corn syrup, or made into ethanol. There's very, very, very little number 2 yellow feed corn that's eaten in a relatively raw form by people. And the same is true of soybeans. Most of the corn products in the market, corn flakes and cornmeal, is made from other varieties of corn. So this Bt sweet corn is really the first food in the food supply where there will be some substantial intakes of Bt proteins in their intact form. And if some people happen to develop or have an allergic reaction to those proteins, it'll be very difficult for consumers and their doctors and the medical community to figure that out if the sweet corn is not labeled. So in this period, this early period of this technology, when there's still a lot of unanswered questions, many people feel that it would be prudent to label the presence of GE proteins in these foods, so that if there is any problem in terms of increased allergies or reproductive problems or increase in cancer risk, whatever, there would be some chance for epidemiologists to detect a connection between consumption of the GE foods and proteins and the adverse health outcome. There's another set of arguments that are really more economic and arise from the functioning of the market. Washington agriculture is incredibly diverse, something like 200 commodities, and a significant portion of Washington agriculture moves offshore into often high-value markets, mostly in the Pacific Rim, but many in the Middle East. And many of those markets are either extraordinarily GE sensitive or just as soon stay away from them, although that's not universally the case. But a significant amount of Washington agricultural exports are going into GE sensitive markets. In the absence of labeling of GE content in apples, in wine, in alfalfa hay, in wheat, the detection of a GE protein in wheat or in alfalfa, like what happened with the alfalfa hay headed for Pacific Rim countries that was grown in Rural City, this incident a couple months ago. In the absence of a credible and accepted labeling scheme, buyers don't know how widespread such a contamination episode might be. And it can really put export market sales in jeopardy, particularly if there had been 2 or 3 or 4 loads over say a 6-month period that got stopped, and even worse if the contamination is detected when the boat goes into the port in Japan or whatever country it's going to, and it gets detected at that point. So when there's credible labeling and segregation of GE conventional, non-GE conventional, and organic, an unexpected and unusual contamination episode can often be dealt with as an atypical situation without placing in jeopardy the movement of large quantities of food. And of course, the other thing that happens when we have these contamination episodes in the absence of labeling is the buyers impose more testing requirements on the exporters. So there's no way to get around the fact that the detection of the Roundup Ready gene in that load of alfalfa that was harvested from a field planted conventional Waterman Loomis seed, that episode has and will continue for a period of time to impose additional testing costs on the industry. The last set of arguments that come up are really more political. I think among people that have worked in this space, there's very little doubt that labeling at the federal level is coming. It's just a question of when and what the process is going to be and what the content of it will be. This is because most other countries have labeling, and it will become increasingly difficult for U.S. Food businesses that export to Europe and other GE-sensitive countries to ship product from the U.S. When General Mills now is manufacturing Cheerios in Europe from non-GE grains, and as are many of the other major U.S. multinational food companies when they're producing non-GE food in countries that have labeling and where consumers are not wanting to purchase GE food. But at some point it will become economically a major cost to U.S.-based food companies and agribusiness to have to not ship U.S. product into these markets. So It's actually kind of interesting. One of the strong arguments for the initiative is that passage of I-522 in Washington will certainly accelerate the process of FDA actually taking up and ultimately putting in place some kind of a federal labeling scheme. That's also an argument that many people in opposition to I-522 make. And I think they're right. I think most supporters of I-522 would agree that the proper place to develop a GE labeling scheme is at the federal level. But in the absence of the FDA being willing to do that, and clearly they have not been willing to do it, despite a legal petition that's been filed a couple years ago with over 1 million signatures, they said in response to the petition calling for the FDA to put in place a rulemaking that would lead to labeling, the FDA said it's not among our current priorities, and we do not have a clear statutory or legislative basis for establishing such a scheme. So until Congress acts, our hands are tied. So I think that labeling is coming at the federal level. Whether it'll be 2 years or 5 years or 8 years, I don't think anyone knows. But I think how the outcome of the I-522 vote in Washington State, if it passes, that will surely accelerate the timetable leading to a serious effort at the federal level to get a scheme in place. And if it doesn't pass, I would suspect that will be read by the food industry as a sign that there's just not enough consumer pressure and political support to move at the federal level or at the state level to impose such labeling schemes. Thanks.
I'm going to stay at this end of the table. I don't have a way to deal with the mic, so.
Not sure what to do here with the. He told me to stay down here.
Oh, you need all your
Because I have all this
props
stuff,
too.
so.
She has props.
Can we help you carry stuff, or would you rather?
Yeah, I'd rather just stay here if that works.
That's fine.
That's,
Yep.
so, thank you. Sorry about that. I thought we had that all worked out, but different people worked on it. So I'm going to focus on Initiative 522 because the voters of Washington have a decision to make, a yes or no decision on this initiative as written. The proponents have written a very flawed initiative that will not give consumers useful information. They started with a blank sheet of paper, could have written anything, and ended up writing an initiative that both the Columbian and the Seattle Times called clumsy, as their editorial boards urged a no vote. In fact, 15 of the major newspapers in Washington State across the board have all urged a no vote on this initiative. The proponents now are saying that the initiative is just a first step, that some information is better than none. Well, ask yourself, if the information provided is incomplete, inaccurate, and inconsistent, isn't that a step backwards? Isn't that misleading? Let me give you a couple of examples here. I-522 would require a genetically engineered label on the front of a package, whether there's any genetic material in the package or not. For example, this package of sugar would have to have a label on the front that says, made with genetically engineered ingredients, even though the nutrition panel on the side clearly shows 0 protein, thus 0 genetic content. But I-522 isn't based on genetic content, and that's why it doesn't tell you what ingredients involved or how it was modified. Let me give you another example of the exemptions. Many foods that do include genetically modified ingredients would be exempt. This cheese is made with a genetically modified enzyme called chymosin. 70% of our cheese is made with chymosin, and yet it would be exempt. So you don't really know what is or is not in your food. Also, all foods sold in restaurants, cafeterias, hospitals, schools is all exempt. So, for example, say you're thirsty someday and you stop in a convenience store, you go to the back of the store, you open the refrigerator case, you pull out a Coke, it would have to be labeled. But if you go to the front of the store and pour yourself a soda at the soda fountain, it's not labeled. Same food, different requirements. 522 appears as a warning label. Nutritional information shows up on the side of the package generally. A warning label looks like the warning label on the front of a cigarette package. That's usually what goes on the front. We have over 600 studies showing there is no cause for concern. As our first speaker said tonight, we have the National Academy of Sciences, the Washington State Academy of Sciences, the World Health Organization, even the European Commission, saying there is no health or safety reason to label. And again, as was pointed out earlier, if for whatever reason you choose not to buy GE food, that is already available through either the organic label or the voluntary non-GMO label. When the Tacoma News Tribune editorialized a no vote, they commented, "Protecting the public's right to know ought to guarantee accurate and complete information." I-522 does the opposite. 522 will increase our costs of food. We estimate $450 a year for the average family. Food companies will remake before they relabel to protect their brand integrity. That's what happened in Europe. That's what would happen here. And that is costly. It hurts low income, including oftentimes students, senior citizens, the most. Proponents have yet to be able to refute a single number in the Washington Research Council analysis showing this increased cost in food. The Washington Academy of Sciences also, in an independent analysis, stated the greatest costs are not in the label, but in the segregation and demonstration of a GE-free status. These costs would affect the price of both GE and non-GE food, and these costs will be passed along to the consumer. 522 is also costly to taxpayers. We estimate, or the Washington Research Council, estimates that it would take up to 200 employees and $22 million a year to implement and enforce this initiative. Now, after that report came out, and initiative proponents, rather than refuting it, began saying, oh, well, just because it passes, we don't have to enforce it. Well, if that isn't bad public policy, I don't know what is. Finally, 522 is unfair to family farmers and food producers. Those who grow or process GE or non-GE food would have to have separate systems for packing, processing, and even transporting foods to ensure 100% GE-free. Now, most of the other labeling schemes do not require 100%. They have tolerances. 522 does not have a tolerance. It requires 100% GE-free. This is a very, very difficult standard to achieve with anything. Extensive record-keeping systems are also required, and sworn statements for every ingredient. It limits future opportunities in crop advances for disease and pest resistance, and even improved nutrition. And finally, it includes a bounty hunter lawsuit provision. So anyone, doesn't even have to be a resident of Washington State, can sue a farmer, a food processor, or a grocery store if they feel a food may be mislabeled. And the comments that were just made about exporting, I want to point out that this applies only to retail sales. So it will not help ag exports at all. In fact, nearly every agricultural group in the state of Washington opposes this initiative. We market round the world. Believe me, if this was going to benefit agricultural exports, our ag groups would be supporting it. It's exactly the opposite. They all oppose it, almost all, because it will not benefit exports from Washington at all. It cuts us apart from the rest of the country. We'd be the only state with such provisions. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time now for questions. We've got a good 30 minutes. And so if you'd like to ask a question, I'd encourage you to go over to the microphone we have over here. We're trying to capture all of this on camera today. And you can direct your comment or your question to one of the panelists or pose it to the whole group, and they can sort among themselves who'd like to answer it.
I haven't decided how I'm going to vote. That's why I'm here. So who benefits if this thing passes? Who's going to make money on it? That's what I want to know. Because there's been a lot of money invested on both sides for this initiative.
The main funding behind the proponents are organic food companies. So organic food companies will benefit because they will have a larger portion of sales.
So let's see, I think the records, official records show that there's over 7,000 people that have donated to the Yes on I-522 campaign, and the average donation is on the order of $35. There are a few large donors. Dr. Broner's Natural Soap has put in several $100,000. I can't remember what the total is. And a few other large companies have, but there's actually quite a broad base and a very small average donation. The 17 million now that's, or whatever it's up to, that's come into the no side is predominantly from the Grocery Manufacturers Association and a handful of global seed, pesticide, biotech companies with an average donation of several $100,000 per donor, if not higher. So obviously the food industry, the large-scale food industry, and Monsanto, Syngenta, DuPont, Pioneer, Bayer, the companies that have now merged the seed industry with the pesticide industry, they see this as a real threat to the business model that's come to be put in place in the U.S. food system.
But who's going to benefit? What sectors of the economy will make money if this thing passes?
Those who sell organic food, because they believe that people will choose not to buy labeled products and will choose instead to buy organic products.
Well, again, that's debatable. The people that sell organic food, everyone knows already that they're non-GE. The I-522 does nothing new to help organic production. It would help the conventional part of the industry that is selling non-GE food. And there's also a non-GMO verified label out there too, which is actually one of the fastest growing food labels. So, I don't think organic's going to benefit near as much as companies that want to hit that space between conventional and organic. The companies that are making, trying to make claims about more sustainable production systems and safer, softer on the environment, et cetera. I think that's where the benefit would come.
But can't they do that now on their own anyway?
They can, and many companies are trying to do just that.
Questions? Would you be willing to go over to the microphone?
May I?
Yes.
I have actually two questions and a point, but I'll try to be brief. My understanding is that for someone to bring a lawsuit in a situation like this, if I-522 passes, they have to have legal standing to do so, and that means they have to prove that they have been harmed. Can somebody tell me whether that's correct? Because if that is true, that contradicts what you said.
No, it actually is almost the opposite. It changes, normally to bring a lawsuit, you have to show legal standing, you have to show that you were harmed. The way this is written, you do not have to show harm in order to sue. So it actually it provides for citizen lawsuits.
Okay. Second question. Heather Hansen, you made the statement that this hurts low-income people the most, but you also stated that there's already an option for people who don't want to eat genetically modified food, and that is to buy organic, which is not really an option for low-income people. Can you reconcile those?
Yes, the comment was that if the price of food goes up, this initiative will drive the cost of food in the grocery store up. And so those people who have less disposable income to spend on food will suffer the most because the cost of all food will be higher.
But they also will not necessarily be able to buy organic if they want to avoid the...
They may not wish to buy organic. They may be looking to get the most value for their food dollar. And their food dollar will not go as far if the cost of all food increases.
And my third question is also, or point is also directed to something you said. If I go into a convenience store today and buy a bottle of Coke, like the one that you have there, and my husband's laughing because I don't like Coke. I wouldn't be doing that, but it has a label on it, and it says sodium, sugar, and so on. If I buy myself a drink and fill a cup and pay for it, that doesn't have a label on it. So, and that's exactly the situation you described with if I-522 passes. But that is also the situation we have right now about other food labeling, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, you can speak.
I think you can hear me without a microphone.
And I'll repeat your question.
I think you didn't fully answer the question, who benefits from the no? And that is Monsanto and a number of other companies who want to sell that product. And they have some kind of fear that you know about that product, therefore it's going to hurt them. They have run into that problem when they sell overseas, and they run into that problem when we had an isolated case of a little patch of wheat that had this exotic gene. So the people that are benefiting are those big companies, and they are the ones that are putting the big amount of money into the opposition.
So I think the question that I answered previously was who benefits if the initiative passes? And so you're taking the opposite side there. And I'll tell you who benefits from a no vote is Washington's farmers, our family farmers, who are very concerned about the increased regulation, the increased liability, the increased cost to them. They are the ones urging a no vote. With respect to the situation you brought up about the wheat, this initiative would have, if 522 was in effect when that happened, would not have had any effect at all. We wouldn't know anything more than we do today about that situation, because this applies only to retail food.
I can talk loud enough.
Well, we're trying to get on the tape.
Oh, okay. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have gotten up. I have a question about items. Is corn syrup, by the way, or GMO manufactured corn syrup in the Midwest, for example?
Most of it.
Most of it is. Okay. My question is that peanut butter ad we had there, organic, it had sugars listed among the contents. Now, what does sugars mean? Sugars normally means, for a manufacturer, corn syrup. And I'm just wondering, if you have, for example, that peanut butter manufactured in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's sold in the state of Washington, must that have a GMO sign on it if it were manufactured with corn syrup in Atlanta? How would they export that to the state of Washington?
Excellent point. You hit a key point there. Yes, it would have to have a label. And since Washington consumes less than 2%, I think, of the nation's food, that's a huge dilemma for manufacturers, because they would have to run a separate line with the Washington label, keep track of inventory separately, put it on a separate pallet. When they, pick the order to ship to the West Coast, keep the Washington labeled food separate. So that's where a lot of the cost increase comes from. It would definitely be more expensive.
This is for the whole panel. Is the statement that federal legislation is coming 5 years, 2 years, 8 years, we don't know how long, but is that statement that it's coming controversial? And I have a follow-up question.
Well, I would say, I think that my view is that certainly the world is becoming more of a segregated marketplace. And so there is a problem for U.S. food companies and U.S. producers. It's not really something that I think I think it's correct to say that FDA has no authority to address that. It would primarily fall into USDA's ballpark, and I have no idea at what level people are thinking about that. I think that, I guess I shouldn't say I have no idea. I don't think it's the most pressing thing on anybody's agenda, but I do, see that there is a certain logic to the idea that sooner or later the U.S. exporters are going to have to, face up to an economic reality that that they're gonna have to deal with this. Now, that doesn't necessarily imply labeling inside the United States. I'm not sure that I would agree that labeling is down the road. But yeah, there's a world marketplace that is getting tougher for U.S. producers.
I'll just add that one of the sort of odd things is that take a company like General Mills that works around the world and has invested, hundreds of millions of dollars into its brand names and does a very good job of I think maintaining extremely high quality and food safety standards. They are number 5 or 6 on the list of food companies supporting the no position on I-522. I think their total giving to the GMA account is on the order of $580,000. I read it the other day. But the CEO, in a conference call within the investment community 10 days ago, who was asked about this, said that General Mills supports federal labeling and feels that that's where it needs to be done. So paradoxically, food companies that invest money in the no campaign, I think many of them are actually in favor of a process now starting at the federal level to get this taken care of, because we're just at the cusp where genetically engineered crops have really been predominantly corn, soybeans, and cotton. Alfalfa is reasonably new on the market, despite a small acreage that was planted in 2005 and 2006. Sugar beets is within the last year or two. And we're just seeing now some important new and including iconic crops like salmon and apples, where the first commercial GE crops may soon be ready to come onto the market. And the food industry is well aware that consumer reaction, potential consumer reaction to those foods and all of the other foods that they're part of in the food supply could really make this a much more complex and costly problem for them. So I think that's why many of them are coming to the view that it's time to deal with not just the labeling issue, but the underlying concerns about the adequacy of safety testing, the control over the seed supply, the impact of the biotech pesticide companies on land-grant universities and plant breeding that goes on at land-grant universities. I mean, there's a huge cluster of issues around the application of this new technology in our food system that have been simmering for many years. And I, to my amazement, I mean, I thought as the debate over GE foods really captured the attention of the European public and policymakers in the food industry in Europe, and it didn't happen here in the US, I thought that it would never happen, but it appears that this concern about GE technology is now picking up, and it really appears to be following much of the trajectory of the issue in Europe only 10 or 12 years ago. So I think that labeling is one of the issues. It's not the only one, but clearly our food system has got to find some ways to bring about a higher degree of confidence and consensus about how to use this new science and technology, or we're just going to set the stage for one fight after another on perhaps different issues, but it's certainly not going to be good for the food system or for farmers or for the food industry.
So just briefly, food distribution doesn't start and stop at state lines. Living here, you live, close to a border. Food crosses that border from Idaho. And so if this passes, Washington will be the only state with this requirement. And that, again, drives up prices because not only the processor, but the trucking companies, the distribution companies, the grocery store chains will all have to segregate out food for Washington from food for the rest of the country. And that segregation and record keeping will drive up costs here.
My follow-up question is for you, Heather. Would your group support federal labeling?
Well, that isn't the choice we have to make right now. We have a ballot initiative.
I understand it's a Washington issue, but down the line.
So the group that we have for this initiative is focused on this initiative, and I can't speak to other issues because I'm here to speak about 522, and that's what we're voting on right now. As time moves on, many things may change. Who knows? I don't predict the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is for Eva and the general public also. I believe that one of the basic framework or assumptions of free market is knowledge of the market and of the good. And this was put in place basically to encourage innovation so that people could market their innovations and differentiate their, whatever they are bringing to the market. Now, if GE, it's, because I see a lot of beneficial attribute, the idea of no or not making that known to the public, isn't that against the basic concept of free market and capitalism as we know it?
Again, the way this initiative is written, it's not providing information. It's not providing clear, accurate, consistent information. Again, you have a food that contains GE content that's exempt from labeling. You have a food that has 0 GE content that would require a label. So it's inconsistent and inaccurate and misleading to consumers. And that's not an appropriate way to make public policy.
But, well, however, the initiative is drafted in a way, and it's quite clear that if a raw agricultural commodity or an ingredient in a processed commodity is derived from a field knowingly planted to a genetically engineered seed, that it has to be labeled. That's what it says, and that's all it says. And there's a distinction if the proponents of I-522 were basing it solely on a concern about allergic reactions to genetically engineered proteins or the presence of novel toxins in genetically engineered food. Heather's point about the fact that the GE proteins are not present in sugar or in some other ingredients derived from a genetically engineered soybean or a genetically engineered corn, the point would be valid. But many people are concerned about and wish to vote with their food dollars, as Paul said, for non-GE agriculture because of concerns other than the presence of the proteins in the food and food safety. For example, the various impacts on the environment from widespread adoption and planting of GE technology, which unfortunately we know quite a bit about that, and it's not always a happy story. So I actually think the drafters of I-522 deserve some credit because it is very specific what it's tailored to require, and that is when either a raw product or an ingredient is derived from a field knowingly planted to a genetically engineered seed, that must be labeled. But if there's gene flow from a neighboring genetically engineered crop into a non-GE crop, that person, the person harvesting that crop or making a food product does not have to label. That adventitious presence would not trigger a labeling requirement as it's written.
Can I give another example? I think is helpful. Okay, it'll be short. But I want to tell you the story about berries. Washington's the #1 raspberry growing state in the nation. We grow a lot of blueberries and a fair number of strawberries. So berries are very important to our agriculture. Picture yourself, you decide you're going to make a berry cobbler for dinner tonight, and you go down to Dismore's, you're walking down the frozen food aisle, and you open the container and pull out a package of berries. And it says on the front of the package, made with genetically modified ingredients. And a lot of people are going to look at that and they're going to wonder, is it the raspberries? Is it the strawberries? I wonder what it is. It's none of the berries. It would be the sugar. Even though there's no GE content, oftentimes they'll add just a little bit of the sugar to a 3-berry mix. And so what are you really learning? It's not telling you that it's herbicide tolerant sugar beets. There's no GE content in the package, but you have this label. That's why it's confusing and misleading.
All right, so it's been kind of touched on that there are some risks, but it's been kind of said that people don't really think there are risks because we haven't seen any yet. But there is the potential that there might be risks in the future. Like maybe there's just something we're not noticing, or there's something that there hasn't been enough time observing GMOs, and that it could be in the future like a Frankenstein's monster. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I won't give you my opinion. I'll give you 600 studies. The American Medical Association, the World Health Organization, the National Academy of Sciences, the European Commission, and many, many, many other scientific organizations around the world, the British Society of Medicine, all say there is no health or safety reason to label.
Well, what they, people can read the same report and get two different messages, but from my reading of the NAS reports, which I've read all carefully, as well as many of these others, it is true that they all make a statement that there is no convincing evidence that anyone has as yet suffered an adverse health problem from consuming genetically engineered food. That statement is in essentially all the reports in about that form. However, almost all of these reports, and clearly all of the NES reports, also speak about the potential for novel allergens and toxins and unintended effects occurring in genetically engineered foods that we lack sufficient tools to either predict or detect, and they call for, often the federal government, to increase research funding in support of the development of more sensitive tools to use to detect, for example, a novel allergen in a BT corn crop. We do know how to check for similarity or homology to a known food allergen. But what about a new food allergen? How do we tell when we might be developing a new food allergen? We know that there's actually a lot of food allergens that are produced in apples. There's a lot of concern about apples and food allergies. So this new Arctic apple that's coming along, it's not been tested using any new and novel methods to determine whether there might be a new food allergen in there. Probably won't be, but we don't know. And I just remind people, DDT, the old chlorinated hydrocarbon insecticide that was introduced post-war in the 50s and used very widely by farmers in the 50s and 60s and started to tail off in the 70s because of environmental problems. There have been, I did a Google search the other day to see how many scientific studies had been done on DDT safety, and there was 12,000 citations, and there's over 400 on cancer studies involving DDT. Well, a professor, Michael Skinner at WSU, professor over on the coast, he has just published a paper that got a lot of attention, pointing to, from studies he's done in rats, that there's a lagged generational impact of exposures to DDT on the propensity of mammals, in this case rats, to develop obesity. And he's done this work on some other pesticides, and now he's done it on DDT. And here we have an insecticide that has been in the hotly debated in terms of safety for 40 years. And there are still new and perhaps profound things to be learned about them. And so for scientists to say that we know for sure that every existing GE food and any future GE food will pose no risk seems to me to be really a bit overboard and lacking in a bit of humility about what we really know about how genes can interact in the environment.
So if there's any potential that this could be causing harm, isn't it our responsibility to label it? Because better safe than sorry, right? I mean...
I would actually say that that's probably an overstatement. I mean, we know for a fact that ordinary plant breeding can introduce new toxins into food and has done so. It's happened numerous times, and the kind of reasoning that any risk requires a label would require a label on everything we eat. I mean, I don't even know if there's any exception to that.
Well, it's impossible to make a statement that something is 100% safe. And so you can think about potatoes, for example. If you allow potatoes to green up, they are now toxic. And there are varieties of potatoes that, when they are cooked, have polyacrylamide in there, which is a neurotoxin. And so we certainly cannot, with any food that we have, make a claim that something is 100% safe. But I will say that as far as the scientific studies that have been done to date on the safety of GE, there is no credible reproducible evidence that eating a genetically modified organism is dangerous for you because it's genetically modified.
So I'll try to make this quick because I know it's starting to get a little late for everybody. I believe back in the 90s, it was Monsanto that took the Bt gene and put it into the potato and actually began growing that. And JP Simplot, the French fry company that we all know about, was actually selling that to McDonald's for, I want to say, 2 to 3 years. Is that correct? And in that case, we had a GMO on the market for an extended period of time. Were there any cited instances of allergic reactions?
No.
Would 2 to 3 years of exposure to, say, I mean, McDonald's, for instance, that's everyone is eating McDonald's, or at least they were at one point, before learning about saturated fats and everything. Isn't that a pretty good national study, if not global study?
Well, another way to look at it is that a lot of GE food, or GE crops are used in animal feed since 1996. And there's been no correlation, or actually no observation of changes in health between those animals that are being fed GE crops versus non-GE crops. So, and when Starlink corn, which was a BT corn that was licensed or approved for animal feed but not human consumption, we had an incident where Starlink corn, because it's virtually impossible in agriculture as we do today to completely separate out, for example, soft white from hard red wheat. You know, there's always going to be a little bit that crosses, and Starlink corn was detected in the human food chain, in our food source. And at that time, in that experiment, there was no evidence of allergic reactions that increased as a result of that. You know, it's interesting, but one of the things that's really important for people to recognize is that correlation also does not equal causation. So one of the large arguments, a very common argument with regard to why GE is dangerous is that now, since '96, we've had an increase in autism, we've had an increase in irritable bowel disease, cancer, we can go down the line with that. And there's a lot of people that want to believe that those diseases are because we've now been eating more GE food. But there's so many things that we've been doing at the same time at an increased rate. How many people in this room have a smartphone? A lot. So it could be that the production of smartphones is why we have increase in autism, cancer, irritable bowel diseases. So that's the point, is that you can't, just because things have changed and other things have changed, doesn't mean that the two things are related. But when we've done these experiments by animal feed or by having Starlink corn get into the human food supply, we've seen no change, no statistical change in disease in those particular examples.
Thank you very much.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. Before we thank our panelists one last time, I want to remind you, if you're a student looking for extra credit, there's a sign-up sheet out in the hall on the table. And also, you're welcome to stay around and have informal conversation with the panelists afterwards. Please join me in thanking them.